Hello. So this video is going to be about paragraph writing. Specifically, we'll be talking about the skill of adding context to your evidence. The goals of this video, first, to understand what adding context is. Second, understand why it's important. Third, understand how to add context when we're writing about nonfiction. Then fourth, how to add context when we're writing about fiction. Just a refresher, the purpose of your evidence is always going to be to support the point of the paragraph that you're writing. It should flow naturally with the rest of your sentences. Also, what context does is it helps your reader understand the evidence properly. The skill that we'll be talking about is paraphrasing, basically putting things into your own words. It's going to help your writing. So when we're writing about fiction and nonfiction, evidence can take different forms. When we're writing about fiction, usually we'll be using quotes or direct examples from the story. That means your context is going to look a little different. If you're writing about nonfiction, you'll usually be using things like statistics, or it could be a direct quote from a source material such as an expert or a textbook. Your context then will be a little bit different. Both ways, you'll need to paraphrase, and again, context is important for both. As an overview definition for context, we'll say that it's additional information that allows the reader to understand why the evidence is relevant. But from there, what we'll do in the video is to look at it when we're writing about nonfiction and then when we're writing about fiction. So let's look at some strategies to adding context. This is for nonfiction. So when we're writing about nonfiction and you're trying to add context, one thing that you can do is explain what the evidence means in comparison to other facts to help put the evidence into perspective. Here's what we mean by that. Let's say the point you're making is that the Roman Empire was remarkably long-lasting. You have a perfectly good bit of evidence saying that it lasted somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years. To make that point even stronger, you might want to choose another bit of information. So this one is that America has been around for 250 years. So now your reader might say, wow, you know what, America's been around for a long time, and it's not even half of the Roman Empire. So the context makes your evidence stronger, which makes the point stronger. Another thing that you can do is to explain how the evidence compares to other things the reader might know. So let's say your point is that the human lung is surprisingly large. You have great statistics on how big the lung is, but it contains approximately 2,400 kilometers of airways. I don't totally know what that means. It's hard to relate to. But then down here, if stretched out, the total surface area of the lung would be about the same size as half a tennis court. So all of a sudden I can visualize half a tennis court, and that gives impact to how big the lung is and makes these statistics more meaningful. Mentioning the source is a great way to provide context. So for instance, you might say something like, oh, a survey says 43% of Americans get news on Facebook. If you're reading that, you might question where they get this fact from. Was it a reputable website? But if instead you say a study conducted by the Pew Research Center reveals the same statistic, people trust the Pew Research Center. So all of a sudden they're going to trust you as an author, and they won't get hung up on questioning your reliability. They'll just listen to the point that you're trying to make. Lastly, assume that whoever is reading your essay or paragraph doesn't know that much about the subject that you're writing about. That way it'll force you to be clear where you otherwise might make assumptions that leave things ambiguous. So now let's look at a point with evidence that's a good point, and both of them have good evidence, but context can really make the point stronger. So this one has no context. Wilt Chamberlain is the most dominant scorer in basketball history. That's the point. It's a great piece of evidence. In 1961-62, he averaged 50 points a game, the highest average in NBA history. So here it supports that he's a great scorer because he has the highest average ever. But imagine if you don't know anything about basketball. You might be like, well, I mean, how good is 50 points? I guess it's the best, but do a lot of people do something like that? Or even if you know something about basketball, you might be like, well, is he number one, but is that his only good season? So here's context to answer some of those questions. He's the most dominant scorer. It's the same stat. He had the 50 points there. The second highest season was in 62-63 when he, so the same guy, scored 44. So now all of a sudden you can see, wow, the number one season is 50. The number two is 44. That's a pretty big jump. In fact, he's the top 4 seasons. So now all of a sudden to support that he's the most dominant, you're like, wow, not only does he have the best season, he has the top 4 best seasons. And then the best season that isn't him is Michael Jordan, which is 37. And again, these numbers give a point of comparison because there's a pretty big gap between 37 and 50. So just by adding context, it helps make your evidence and therefore your point stronger. Now we want to talk about writing about writing about fiction and using context. So usually you'll be pulling quotes from the story. You need to let your reader know what's going on when that quote happens. So paraphrase the setting, paraphrase the plot, and the significance of the quote you're using. Again, assume that the person reading your essay or paragraph hasn't read the book before. So let's use this 100 word short story by Lisa Miller as a source material so we can dig into different ways to use context. So, Dan seemed to have lived an unremarkable life. His obituary read, Dan Jones died at an age of 75. He was born in Somerset, Pennsylvania, where he lived all of his life. An accountant, he was survived by his wife Beth and son Dan Jr. He cherished his dog Blue and enjoyed driving his gray sports car. At his funeral, an unknown homeless man stood up and spoke. My friend Dan was a remarkable man, he said. For over 20 years, he brought me lunch to eat with him in the city park. Never missed a day. A surprise for all who knew Dan. So, if you're going to use a quote, we need to explain what's happening in the quote. So let's say the point that you're trying to make is a theme of An Extraordinary Man by Lisa Miller is that sometimes a person's best qualities can be hidden even to their friends and family. And to support that, you're saying Miller writes that the information was a surprise for all who knew Dan. Now we just read the story, so this makes sense. That surprising information was that Dan was such a great guy. But notice if we're trying to support the idea that Dan's best qualities and we just say that there was new information that was surprising. I mean, surprises could be good or they could be bad. So if you hadn't just read the story, this would be confusing and it wouldn't really prove this idea of best qualities. If you add the context, Dan, an otherwise ordinary man, is revealed in a new light at his funeral when a homeless man tells everyone that Dan had provided him lunch every day for 20 years, a fact that was a surprise for all who knew Dan. All of a sudden we've switched. Now the reader knows what happened, what the surprise was. The surprise was that Dan's a great guy, and it now supports the point. So here we're just sort of letting the reader know what the circumstance was that allowed the quote to happen. I'm hoping that you can see that in this example, when there was no context, the connection, the understanding the reader has of why this evidence matters is pretty weak. But when we add the context, it makes a lot more sense. So literally the difference between understanding and not understanding is the difference between having proper context and having improper context. So to sum up, our goals were to understand what adding context is, why it's important, to understand how to add context when we're writing about nonfiction, and to understand how to add context when we're writing about fiction. Hopefully that's helpful. Have a great day. Thanks.